But tonight, we follow those children of Israel, those descendants of Abraham, as they went down into Egypt. Last Sunday evening, we concluded with the account of how Joseph, who had been sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers, was down there. His brothers eventually had to come down there to get grain, and eventually the whole family, including their father, Jacob or Israel, the whole family, the whole clan, the whole tribe, moved down to the land of Egypt. And they went down there initially, 70 persons in all. And they went down there not really intending to stay beyond the time of the famine. When they went down there, there were still 5 more years of famine. And Joseph had said, y'all come on down here. There's still 5 more years of famine. And so they had gone down there initially to find care and protection from those remaining 5 years of famine. But as we suggested, a lot of times we go somewhere intending to stay a short time and end up staying a lot longer than we meant. I'm sure it didn't dawn on them when they went down there, they might go down there and spend the next 430 years. But that's exactly what happened. And of course, at first, things went very well with them. As long as Joseph was still there and people who remembered Joseph were there, their status was quite good. And they prospered there in the land of Egypt. But in the book of Exodus chapter 1, about verse 7, we read that eventually there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And the children of Israel, who had initially found protection there in the land of Egypt, found themselves turned into slaves. And I would suggest that it's often that way when we seek protection in the world, that there is some help that is available, and for a period of time they found themselves protected by the Egyptians. But sooner or later the world always turns against the people of God. And so it was with the children of Israel. The favor that they had enjoyed ran out. And eventually the Egyptians became afraid of the rapid growth of the Israelites, so much so that they ordered all the male children of the Israelites to be killed. And it was in that context, of course, that eventually Moses was born. And this Moses was the one that God chose, that God raised up to deliver the children of Israel out of that bondage of Egypt. Now it's interesting that there's really about 400 years right there. 400 years is no small amount of time. I mean, you think this country's only been in existence as a nation for a little over 200 years. Well, roughly double that. There's a period of about 400 years that the Bible just basically skips over. I mean, it tells us about it, that it happened. But it doesn't tell us about all those 400 years that they were enslaved. It tells us how they got into slavery, and it tells us how they got out. But what all was happening during that period of time? Well, in a sense, it's kind of like the story of the promise was on hold. And God had really left them down there in Egypt for that 400 years. And then when the book of Exodus picks up, the real story is how God gets them out of that and how God raised up Moses to deliver them from bondage. And of course, we know the story of Moses, how he was hidden when he was born by his parents in the little ark made of the bulrushes, how he was eventually raised by Pharaoh's daughter, how he had to flee the land of Egypt after he had killed an Egyptian trying to protect one of his fellow Israelites, how he spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro, before finally, at the age of about 80 years, God appeared to him at the burning bush at Mount Sinai and instructed him to go back to Egypt, that God had chosen him to lead his people out of that land. And we know the story as well, how Moses, at first fearful, eventually obeyed God's command and went back to the land of Egypt, how God had given him the power to perform great signs and wonders before Pharaoh. And we know the story of the plagues. And we know the water turned to blood, and the lice and the flies and the darkness, all of that sequence of plagues that God brought on the Egyptians to break the power of Pharaoh and compel Pharaoh and the Egyptians to let the children of Israel go. And we're going to pick up tonight in Exodus chapter 12, in the book of Exodus, the 12th chapter. Well, in Exodus chapter 12, 9 of the 10 plagues had already occurred. And the 9th plague was the plague of darkness. To us, the plague of darkness might not seem all that terrifying. But you have to realize that in the world of the land of Egypt, all of their major gods were sun gods. If there's anything that dominates the land of Egypt, it is the sun. It almost never rains in Egypt. There's hardly ever a cloud in the sky in Egypt. And their principal deities, especially the big four, were all various aspects of the sun. And God had said that in those plagues he was going to execute judgment not only on the Egyptians, but on the gods of Egypt as well. And when God brought that great darkness over the land of Egypt, that was irrefutable proof to the Egyptians that their gods were powerless before Jehovah, the God of Israel. And Pharaoh had really, at first it looked like reached the point where he was going to break. But then, as he had done so many times, he changed his mind again and ordered that the children of Israel not be able to leave the land of Egypt. And it was on that occasion that God had, through Moses, told Pharaoh that there was going to be one more plague. And that one more plague was going to be the death of all the firstborn throughout the land of Egypt, save, of course, where the children of Israel were. And so Moses made that announcement to Pharaoh. He told him, he said, "You said, I don't want to see your face anymore. You're right. You won't see my face anymore." He says, "But you will, after tonight, send and ask us to leave the land, and we will go." And of course, that's what happened. God had known that that was what was going to take place, and God had already been making provisions and told the children of Israel what provisions they were to be making for that night, so that when all the firstborn in the land of Egypt were slain, their children would not be slain. And I want to pick up reading with you. In Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 3, God said to Moses, "Speak to the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of the month they are to take each one a lamb for themselves, according to their father's household, a lamb for each household." It says in verse 5 that the lamb is to be an unblemished male, a year old, and they are to keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And then the whole assembly of the congregation was to kill it in the evening. And they were to take some of the blood of this lamb, in verse 7, and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they lived. And they were in those houses with the doorposts smeared with blood that night to eat the flesh of the remainder of the lamb. Verse 8, they would eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire. They were given instructions as to how to eat it. And in verse 11 it says they would eat it in this manner, with their loins girded, their sandals on their feet, and their staff in their hand. And they were to eat it in haste. It was the Lord's Passover. And the Lord said in verse 12, "I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." He says, "And the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And this day," he says in verse 14, "will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance." Well, later in the chapter, we're told in verse 21 that Moses called the elders of Israel, and he gave them those instructions to go take those lambs and prepare them and slay the Passover lamb, and to put the blood, in verse 22, in a basin, and put some of the blood that is on the two doorposts and on the lintel of their houses, so that the Lord, in verse 23, will pass through. When he does pass through to smite the Egyptians, and he sees the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the house and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. And in verse 29, it says, "It came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the cattle, from the highest to the lowest, and of course everything in between. And indeed, Pharaoh arose in that night, and when he saw what had happened, he sent, and he ordered that the children of Israel be given permission, in fact, that they be entreated, that they be begged to leave the land of Egypt, and to leave praying for him as well. And so they did. And in verse 37, it says, "The sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot. We're told that there was a mixed multitude with them, and that they took their unleavened bread with them as they left, because they left in such a hurry." And in verse 40 it says, "Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came about at the end of 430 years to that very day, that all the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. A night to be observed," says verse 42, "for the Lord, for having brought them out of the land of Egypt." That, of course, was the first Passover. That was the Passover. All the subsequent Passovers were commemorations of that great event, where God delivered the children of Israel from their bondage there in Egypt. And, of course, the follow-up, the next chapters tell how they left the land of Egypt. And the final point of being delivered, of being out of the land of Egypt, was when God parted the waters of the Red Sea, even as Pharaoh, having changed his mind once again, was pursuing them to kill them. And they passed through the waters of the Red Sea and came out safe on the other side. And Pharaoh and his army pursuing and trying to catch them were drowned in the sea. Not Pharaoh drowned, but his army drowned while he watched on the other side. And that's the story, of course, of the Passover and God delivering the children of Israel from the land of Egypt.